Chaos erupts at 30,000 feet as a flight attendant screams at three 8-year-old children, her voice cutting through the airplane cabin like a knife. Passengers frantically pull out their phones, recording what's about to become the most shocking airline incident of the year. The children, three beautiful black triplets, huddle together as this woman towers over them, her face twisted with rage over something as simple as spilled juice. But then, something incredible happens. A man in first class slowly rises from his seat, his expression cold as ice. He walks down that narrow aisle with the confidence of someone who owns the world, and when he speaks, his voice carries the weight of absolute authority. "Ma'am, you're addressing my children, and as of this moment, you're fired permanently." The entire cabin falls silent. The flight attendant's face goes white as she realizes she's just made the biggest mistake of her career. But how did we get to this moment of perfect justice? And why didn't anyone see this coming? Let me take you back to where this incredible story really begins. Because what happened on Flight 447 that day will restore your faith in karma and show you that sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected places. It was a typical Tuesday morning at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Flight 447 to Chicago was preparing for what should have been a routine 2-hour journey. But sometimes, the most ordinary days become extraordinary for all the wrong reasons, and then transform into something beautiful when the right person steps up. The first passengers to catch everyone's attention were three 8-year-old children walking down the jet bridge with matching unaccompanied minor tags around their necks. Meet Jasmine, Jordan, and Jalen Williams, triplets who couldn't be more different despite sharing the same birthday. Jasmine, the quiet artist of the group, clutched a small sketchbook to her chest, her eyes wide with nervous excitement. Jordan, the curious chatterbox, peppered the gate agent with questions about how planes fly and how high they'd be going. And then there was Jalen, older than his siblings by just 3 minutes, but carrying himself with the protective instinct of a big brother who took his responsibilities seriously. These weren't just any children. These were honor roll students, raised by a single mother who worked double shifts as a nurse to give them every opportunity in life. They'd never flown alone before. But today was special. They were finally old enough to visit their grandmother in Chicago by themselves, a milestone their mother had been preparing them for with weeks of careful instruction about airplane etiquette and staying together. As they boarded the plane, their excitement was infectious. Other passengers smiled at their whispered conversations about window seats and cloud shapes. They were polite, well-behaved, and absolutely adorable. The kind of children any parent would be proud of. But not everyone saw them that way. Sarah Mitchell, a 12-year veteran flight attendant, watched the triplets board with immediate irritation. At 35, Sarah had dedicated over a decade of her life to this airline, working her way up through countless flights, difficult passengers, and endless nights away from home. She'd recently been passed over for promotion to crew supervisor, a position that went to someone younger. Someone who happened to be black, and someone Sarah believed was less qualified than herself. The divorce papers were still fresh in her purse, along with mounting bills and the bitter taste of a career that felt stuck in neutral. Sarah had been taking her frustrations out on passengers for months, but today, seeing these three unaccompanied children, something darker stirred in her chest. She leaned over to Emma Chen, the junior flight attendant working her 3rd month on the job, and whispered loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Great, just what we needed today. Unsupervised kids who are probably going to cause trouble the entire flight. Mark my words, Emma. These types always do." Emma, who had looked up to Sarah as a mentor, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. She watched the triplets settle into their seats in row 12, noticing how Jalen helped Jasmine store her art supplies in the seat pocket, and how Jordan shared his window seat view with his siblings. What Sarah didn't know, what none of them knew, was that someone else was watching this entire interaction unfold. In first class, seat 2A, sat a man who looked like he could be anyone's father, uncle, or successful businessman heading to an important meeting. Marcus Williams, 42 years old, wore a simple navy suit and carried himself with quiet confidence. To fellow passengers, he was just another frequent flyer. But Marcus Williams was so much more than that. He was the self-made CEO and majority shareholder of Pinnacle Airlines, the very airline they were flying on. More importantly, he was the father of those 3 beautiful children, sitting in row 12. Marcus had built his airline empire from absolutely nothing. Adopted from foster care at 16, after years of bouncing between homes, he knew what it felt like to be overlooked, dismissed, and treated as less than human. Those experiences had forged him into a man of incredible determination and unwavering principles. Every decision he made, every policy he implemented, was guided by the simple belief that dignity and respect weren't privileges, they were rights. Today, he was flying commercial instead of using his private jet for a very specific reason. Marcus made it a point to regularly experience his airline from the customer's perspective. He wanted to see what passengers saw, feel what they felt, and ensure that the Pinnacle Airlines experience lived up to the values he'd built the company on. But there was another reason he was on this particular flight. His ex-wife had asked him to let the triplets fly alone for the first time as part of building their independence. Against his protective instincts, he'd agreed. But not without secretly booking himself on the same flight to watch over them from a distance. He'd already been proud watching them navigate the boarding process with such maturity. Jasmine's quiet strength reminded him of his own tendency to observe before acting. Jordan's endless questions and enthusiasm brought joy to his often serious world. And Jalen's protective nature toward his siblings, that reminded Marcus of himself at that age, always trying to shield others from the harshness he'd experienced. From his first-class seat, Marcus had a clear view down the aisle to where his children sat. He watched Sarah Mitchell's interaction with Emma, his jaw tightening as he caught enough of her words to understand their meaning. He'd spent years in boardrooms reading people, and he could see the hostility radiating from this woman toward his children before anything had even happened. Captain Rodriguez, a veteran pilot with 20 years of experience, was conducting his pre-flight checks when he noticed the tension beginning to build in the cabin. He'd flown with Sarah Mitchell many times and had noticed her attitude growing increasingly negative over the past few months. As someone who prided himself on running a professional operation, he made a mental note to keep an eye on the situation. In seat 15C sat Mrs. Patterson, a 73-year-old retired teacher who was flying to Chicago to visit her new great-grandchild. She'd spent 40 years in classrooms and could spot well-behaved children from a mile away. The triplets reminded her of some of her best students, curious, respectful, and full of potential. She'd already decided that if they needed anything during the flight, she'd be happy to help. David Kim, a social media manager in seat 18A, was scrolling through his phone when he overheard Sarah's comment about the children. As someone who'd experienced discrimination himself growing up as a Korean American, those words hit him like a physical blow. He looked up at the triplets, who were doing absolutely nothing wrong, and felt his protective instincts kick in. Without even realizing it, he positioned his phone where he could quickly start recording if needed. The stage was set, though none of them knew it yet. In a few short hours, this routine flight would become a viral sensation that would change lives, end careers, and prove that sometimes the universe has a perfect sense of timing. If you're already invested in seeing how this incredible story unfolds, welcome to Mirror Stories, where every story holds a mirror to humanity for truth and justice. Show us some love by clicking the like and subscribe button. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment where you're watching and what time it's for you right now. As the plane pushed back from the gate and began taxiing toward the runway, Sarah Mitchell was already watching the triplets like a hawk, waiting for her first opportunity to pounce. She had no idea that every move she was about to make was being observed by the one person who had the power to end her career with a single word. The children, meanwhile, pressed their faces to the windows, marveling at how small the world looked from above as they climbed into the sky. They had no idea that they were about to become the center of a confrontation that would test everything their mother had taught them about dignity, respect, and standing up for what's right. And Marcus Williams? He sat in first class, monitoring every interaction, his protective instincts on high alert. He'd built an airline based on treating every passenger like family. Today, he was about to discover if that culture extended to his own children, or if he'd need to remind everyone exactly whose airline they were flying on. Sarah Mitchell was about to show her true colors in the most disgusting way possible. The first incident happened just 30 minutes into the flight. Jasmine, the quiet artist of the Triplets, was carefully arranging her colored pencils and sketchbook when the plane hit a small patch of turbulence. Her art supplies scattered into the aisle, a completely innocent accident that any reasonable person would understand. But Sarah Mitchell saw it as her opening. She swooped down on that 8-year-old girl like a predator, her voice sharp and accusatory. "Excuse me, young lady, but you're disrupting service and creating a safety hazard. This is exactly what I was talking about." The venom in her tone made nearby passengers look up in shock. Here was a grown woman, a professional flight attendant, berating a child for an accident. Jasmine's eyes filled with tears as she scrambled to pick up her supplies, her hands shaking with embarrassment. That's when Jordan, her protective brother, jumped up to help his sister. "She didn't mean to," he said with the earnest sincerity that only children possess. "It was just the plane moving." But instead of showing compassion, Sarah turned her fury on Jordan too. "Sit down right now. Both of you need to learn that actions have consequences, and your behavior is completely unacceptable on my aircraft." My aircraft. Did you catch that? Sarah Mitchell actually called it her aircraft, as if she owned the plane instead of just working on it. That's when Jalen, all of 8 years old but wise beyond his years, stepped between Sarah and his siblings. He didn't raise his voice or show disrespect, but his stance was clear. He was protecting his family. "Ma'am, we're sorry for the accident, but please don't yell at my sister." The sight of this small boy standing up to a grown woman should have melted anyone's heart. Instead, it seemed to fuel Sarah's anger even more. From first class, Marcus Williams watched this interaction with his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles went white. What Sarah didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that she was recreating Marcus's worst childhood memory right before his eyes. Marcus was 9 years old, riding a city bus to his foster home after school, when his backpack zipper broke and his books scattered across the aisle. Instead of helping, the bus driver had screamed at him, calling him another one of those foster kids who can't take care of anything. The other passengers had stared, some shaking their heads in disgust, as 9-year-old Marcus crawled around picking up his belongings while tears streamed down his face. That humiliation had stayed with him for 33 years. It was part of what drove him to build an airline where every passenger, regardless of age, race, or circumstance, would be treated with dignity. And now, watching his own children face the same degradation he'd experienced, every protective instinct he possessed was screaming at him to intervene. But Marcus forced himself to stay seated. He'd promised his ex-wife he would let the children handle this flight independently unless there was real danger. He trusted his children's strength, but he was beginning to question whether his trust had been misplaced. Meanwhile, Sarah was just getting started. As she continued her tirade against the Triplets, Emma Chen, the junior flight attendant, watched in growing discomfort. This wasn't the mentorship she'd signed up for. Emma had joined this airline because of its reputation for excellent customer service, but what she was witnessing felt more like bullying than professional conduct. During a quiet moment in the galley, Sarah began revealing the bitterness that was truly driving her behavior. "You know what, Emma? I've been doing this job for 12 years. 12 years of dealing with entitled passengers and ungrateful management. And what do I have to show for it? A failed marriage, mounting bills, and watching less qualified people get promoted over me." Emma listened, trying to be supportive, but something in Sarah's tone made her uncomfortable. "That supervisor position I applied for? It went to Marcus Thompson, someone with half my experience, just because he checked the right diversity boxes. Now I'm supposed to smile and pretend everything's fine while dealing with—" Sarah gestured toward the Triplets, leaving her sentence unfinished, but her meaning crystal clear. Emma's stomach dropped. She was beginning to understand that Sarah's hostility toward the children wasn't about their behavior at all. It was about something much darker and more troubling. The second escalation came during meal service, and it was even worse than the first. Jordan, being the curious and social child he was, waited patiently for Sarah to finish serving the row in front of them before politely raising his hand. "Excuse me, ma'am. Could I please have extra cookies for my brother and sister? We're sharing everything because Mama taught us to always take care of each other." It was such an innocent request, delivered with the kind of politeness any parent would be proud of. But Sarah's response was swift and cruel. "Some people need to learn they can't have everything they want in life. You get what you're given, and you should be grateful for that." The harshness of her words hit Jordan like a slap. His face crumpled with confusion. He couldn't understand why asking nicely for cookies had made this woman so angry. That's when Mrs. Patterson, the retired teacher sitting 2 rows back, reached into her own meal tray and stood up. "Sweetheart," she said to Jordan with grandmotherly warmth, "you can have my cookies. I wasn't going to eat them anyway." What should have been a beautiful moment of human kindness instead became Sarah's next target. She whirled around to face Mrs. Patterson with barely contained rage. "Ma'am, you cannot redistribute airline meals. There are protocols and procedures, and I will not have passengers undermining my authority." The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Here was a flight attendant literally preventing an elderly woman from sharing cookies with children. The absurdity and cruelty of it was breathtaking. David Kim had seen enough. Quietly, discreetly, he positioned his phone and began recording. As someone who managed social media for a living, he knew exactly what kind of content went viral. And this was it. But more than that, as someone who'd faced discrimination himself, he couldn't stand by and watch these children be treated this way. Other passengers began exchanging glances, uncomfortable murmurs rippling through the cabin. A businessman in row 10 shook his head in disgust. A young mother clutched her own child closer, horrified by what she was witnessing. An older gentleman actually stood up as if to intervene, then sat back down, unsure of what to do. Emma Chen felt sick to her stomach. She'd looked up to Sarah as a mentor, but now she was seeing her true character. This wasn't about unruly children or airline protocols. This was about a woman taking out her personal frustrations on innocent kids who happened to be black. From first class, Marcus's jaw was clenched so tightly he thought his teeth might crack. Every fiber of his being wanted to march down that aisle and put an end to this harassment immediately. But he held back, trusting that surely, this couldn't get any worse. He was wrong. The third escalation, the breaking point, came 20 minutes later, and it was the moment that would change everything. The plane hit a patch of moderate turbulence, the kind that makes drinks slosh and passengers grip their armrests. Jalen was carefully sipping his apple juice when the plane dropped suddenly, causing the liquid to spill across his shirt. It was a completely natural accident, the kind of thing that happens on flights every single day. But Sarah Mitchell saw it as her moment for total domination. She stormed over to the triplets with fury that was completely disproportionate to a simple spilled drink. "That's it. I've had enough of your destructive, unsupervised behavior. You 3 are clearly not mature enough to be flying alone, and I will not have you disrupting this entire flight." Jasmine began crying quietly, overwhelmed by the unfairness of it all. Jordan moved closer to his siblings, his usual chatter replaced by frightened silence. But it was Jalen's response that broke everyone's heart and revealed the incredible character these children possessed. Standing up to face Sarah Mitchell, this grown woman who towered over him, 8-year-old Jalen spoke with dignity that would put most adults to shame. "My mama taught us to be respectful, but she also taught us we don't have to accept disrespect." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Here was a child, displaying more grace and wisdom than the adult who was supposed to be caring for him. Sarah's face turned red with rage. "How dare you talk back to me? That's it. You 3 are being moved to the back of this plane, away from decent passengers who don't want to deal with your kind of behavior." Your kind of behavior. Everyone in earshot caught the implication. The coded language that made Sarah's true motivations crystal clear. That was the moment David Kim's recording finger hit the start button. That was the moment Emma Chen realized she was witnessing something that would haunt her forever if she didn't act. That was the moment Mrs. Patterson stood up again, her teacher instincts screaming that this was wrong. And that was the moment Marcus Williams realized his children needed him to stop being a distant observer and start being their father. The cabin was about to witness an explosion of justice that no one, especially Sarah Mitchell, would ever forget. What happened next crossed every line of human decency and professionalism that exists. Sarah Mitchell, triggered by an 8-year-old's dignified response, completely lost what little control she had left. Her face contorted with rage as she reached down and grabbed Jalen's arm, actually put her hands on this child, and yanked him toward her. "Don't you ever talk back to me again," she hissed, her grip tight enough to leave marks. "I am calling ahead to have you 3 removed at the next stop for unruly behavior. You're exactly the type that always causes problems, and I won't tolerate it on my flight." The type. She actually said it. Out loud. In front of a cabin full of witnesses. The gasps that rippled through the plane were audible. This wasn't just poor customer service anymore. This was assault, discrimination, and child abuse happening at 30,000 feet. Jasmine's quiet crying turned into sobs of fear. Jordan pressed himself against the window, trembling, and Jalen, despite the pain in his arm, looked this woman in the eye with courage that defied his age. That's when the phones came out. Not just David Kim's careful recording, but multiple passengers throughout the cabin started filming. The businessman in row 10, the young mother with her own child. Even Mrs. Patterson fumbled with her smartphone, determined to capture this injustice. The clicking and beeping of recording apps filled the air like a digital uprising. Emma Chen stood frozen in the galley, watching her mentor's career implode in real time. She knew she should intervene, knew she should call for the captain, knew she should do something. But she was paralyzed by the magnitude of what she was witnessing. And in first class, Marcus Williams had seen enough. For 18 minutes, he had watched this woman systematically terrorize his children. He had trusted in their strength, believed in their ability to handle adversity with grace, and hoped against hope that someone else would step in to stop this madness. But when Sarah Mitchell put her hands on his son, when she threatened to have them removed from the plane like common criminals, when she used that loaded phrase about the type that always causes problems, that was the moment Marcus Williams stopped being a distant observer and became a father whose children needed him. He stood up from seat 2A with the kind of controlled precision that comes from years of boardroom negotiations and high-stakes business deals. Every eye in first class turned to watch this well-dressed man walk purposefully down the aisle toward economy, his expression calm, but his eyes burning with barely contained fury. The other first-class passengers sensed something significant was about to happen. A woman in 1B actually leaned into the aisle to get a better view. The flight was about to get very interesting. Marcus walked past row after row of passengers, all of whom were now watching this unfolding drama with rapt attention. Some were still recording on their phones. Others whispered to their seatmates about what they'd witnessed. The energy in the cabin was electric with anticipation. Everyone could feel that a reckoning was coming. When Marcus reached row 12, Sarah was still gripping Jalen's arm, still spewing threats about having the children removed. She was so consumed with her power trip that she didn't even notice the well-dressed man approaching until his shadow fell across her. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Excuse me, ma'am. Are you the senior crew member handling my children's care?" Sarah looked up, irritation flashing across her face at this interruption to her tirade. She didn't recognize Marcus. Why would she? He flew first class, dressed down, and made it a point not to flaunt his position. To her, he was just another passenger sticking his nose where it didn't belong. "Sir, please return to your seat," she snapped, not loosening her grip on Jalen's arm. "These unaccompanied minors are being disruptive, and I'm handling the situation according to airline policy." Marcus's eyes flicked to his son's arm, still trapped in this woman's grasp, then back to her face. His voice remained perfectly calm, but those who knew him well would have recognized the danger in that tone. I see, and you are? The question seemed to inflate Sarah's ego even further. Here was her chance to assert her authority over this interfering passenger. She straightened up, puffing out her chest with self-importance. Sarah Mitchell, senior flight attendant, with 12 years of experience. And you need to return to your seat immediately before I have you. Marcus Williams, he interrupted, his voice cutting through her threats like a blade. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his identification, holding it where she could see it clearly. CEO and majority shareholder of Pinnacle Airlines. These are my children. The words hit the cabin like a thunderclap. Sarah's face went from red with anger to white with shock in the span of a heartbeat. Her grip on Jalen's arm released so suddenly that the boy stumbled backward into his seat. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no sound came out. Emma Chen's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror as she realized the magnitude of what had just happened. Her mentor hadn't just been abusing 3 random children, she'd been torturing the CEO's kids right in front of him. The entire cabin fell into a silence so complete you could hear the airplane's engines humming. Passengers craned their necks to get a better view. Some lowered their phones in shock, while others kept recording, sensing they were witnessing airline history in the making. Captain Rodriguez, who had been monitoring the situation from the cockpit through reports from other crew members, chose that moment to emerge from behind the flight deck door. His experienced eyes took in the scene immediately. A shell-shocked flight attendant, 3 tearful children, a well-dressed man holding CEO credentials, and an entire cabin of passengers with their phones out recording everything. This was about to become a very long day. Marcus looked down at his children, his brave, beautiful children, who had handled this abuse with more grace than most adults could muster. Jasmine was still crying softly. Jordan was pressed against the window in fear, and Jalen was rubbing his arm where Sarah's fingerprints were still visible on his dark skin. When Marcus spoke again, his voice carried 15 years of building an airline from nothing. 15 years of creating company policies designed to treat every passenger with dignity, and 15 years of believing that respect wasn't something you earned, it was something you deserved, simply for being human. Miss Mitchell, he said, and the way he pronounced her name made it sound like a curse. In my 15 years building this airline from the ground up, in my 15 years of establishing policies and procedures designed to ensure every passenger is treated with dignity and respect, I have never been more ashamed of an employee than I am at this moment. His voice rose slightly, not to a shout, but to the kind of controlled fury that's far more terrifying than screaming. You have harassed, intimidated, and discriminated against 3 children who were placed under our care. You have violated every single company policy we have regarding customer service, child welfare, and basic human decency. You have assaulted a minor. Yes, grabbing my son's arm constitutes assault, and you have done it all while representing my airline. Sarah's legs looked like they might give out. She reached for the seat back to steady herself, her face now a sickly green color. The full weight of her actions was crashing down on her like an avalanche. But most importantly, Marcus continued, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face, you have traumatized 3 8-year-old children who did nothing wrong. They were polite, respectful, and well-behaved throughout this entire ordeal. The only disruption on this flight has been your unprofessional, discriminatory, and frankly disgusting behavior toward passengers who deserve so much better than what you've given them. The cabin remained dead silent. Even the crying babies seemed to have paused to listen to this moment of absolute justice being served at cruising altitude. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward, his voice professional but grim. Mr. Williams, I've been monitoring the situation from the cockpit. I want you to know that I will be filing a full incident report, and I have witnesses from both crew and passengers who can verify everything that's transpired. Marcus nodded to the captain, then turned back to Sarah, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the airplane floor. Miss Mitchell, I want you to look at my children. Really look at them. These are honor roll students. They are being raised by a single mother who works double shifts as a nurse to give them every opportunity in life. They have never been in trouble, never been disruptive, never been anything but a source of pride and joy to everyone who knows them. He paused, letting that sink in. And you decided to terrorize them because of what? Because they're black? Because they're children flying alone? Because you're having a bad day? Because you didn't get a promotion you felt entitled to? Sarah's eyes widened. How did he know about the promotion? Of course, CEOs know everything that happens in their companies. Her whole world was crumbling around her, and she was finally understanding that her career, her reputation, her entire future had just gone up in flames. The passengers were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't just a customer complaint or a bad review. This was the owner of the airline personally delivering justice to an employee who had forgotten that every passenger, regardless of age, race, or seat assignment, was a human being deserving of respect. And this was only the beginning of Sarah Mitchell's very, very bad day. Marcus wasn't finished. Not even close. He turned away from the trembling flight attendant and addressed the entire cabin, his voice carrying the authority of someone who truly understood customer service. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to personally apologize for this inexcusable behavior from our staff. What you've witnessed today goes against every value that Pinnacle Airlines was built on. Every passenger on this flight will receive a full refund for your ticket, plus vouchers for future travel, as our way of acknowledging that you should never have been subjected to this. The passengers erupted in surprised murmurs. A full refund and travel vouchers? That was unheard of in the airline industry. But Marcus Williams wasn't just covering his company's liability, he was making a statement about what real leadership looked like. Then he turned back to Sarah, and his voice became ice cold. Miss Mitchell, you are terminated, effective immediately. Your employment with Pinnacle Airlines ends right here, right now. Security will be meeting you when we land, and Captain Rodriguez will be completing a full incident report that will be forwarded to the appropriate authorities. You will never work in the aviation industry again if I have anything to say about it. Sarah's legs finally gave out, and she collapsed into an empty seat, the full weight of her actions finally hitting her. 12 years of employment gone. Her career destroyed. Her reputation in ruins. All because she couldn't treat 3 children with basic human decency. But what happened next was even more powerful than Marcus's justice. It was the moment when good people found their voices and chose to stand up for what was right. Emma Chen, the junior flight attendant who had watched her mentor's behavior in growing horror, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. Her voice shook as she addressed Marcus and the children. Mr. Williams, I need you to know that I witnessed everything, and I should have spoken up earlier. I should have stopped this the moment it started. And I failed those children by staying silent. I'm so sorry. It took incredible courage for Emma to admit her mistake in front of the entire cabin, but sometimes growth requires us to acknowledge our failures before we can become better. Mrs. Patterson, the retired teacher, stood up from her seat with the dignity that comes from 7 decades of life experience. If I may, she said, her voice carrying across the cabin, I want these children to know that what happened to them today happened to me in 1962 when I was their age. A bus driver in Montgomery refused to let me sit with white children on a school trip. But you know what? That experience didn't break me, it made me stronger. And it made me determined to spend my life teaching children that they are worthy of respect, regardless of the color of their skin. She looked directly at Jasmine, Jordan, and Jalen. You 3 handled this situation with more grace and dignity than that woman deserved. Don't let her ignorance dim your light. David Kim held up his phone, his voice steady with conviction. Mr. Williams, I recorded everything that happened here today. If you need this as evidence, it's yours. But I also want everyone to know why I started recording. Because staying silent when we witness discrimination makes us complicit in it. We all have a responsibility to speak up when we see injustice, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us. And then something beautiful happened. One by one, passengers throughout the cabin began standing up to offer support to the triplets. A businessman offered his business card, promising college scholarships if the children kept up their good grades. A young mother with her own daughter approached to tell them how proud she was of their strength. An elderly gentleman who had served in the military saluted Jalen for his courage in protecting his siblings. The cabin that had witnessed such ugliness 20 minutes earlier was now filled with the most beautiful display of human kindness and solidarity you could imagine. But the most powerful moment came when Marcus knelt down to his children's level, his CEO authority melting away to reveal just a father who loved his kids more than anything in the world. "I owe you three an apology," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was here the whole time, watching everything that happened, and I should have protected you sooner. I wanted you to experience flying independently, to build your confidence and show you that you could handle challenges on your own. But I never, ever expected someone would treat you this way." Jalen, still rubbing his arm where Sarah had grabbed him, looked at his father with confusion and hurt. "Dad, why was she so mean to us? We didn't do anything wrong." Marcus's answer was one that every parent who has ever had to explain discrimination to their child will recognize. "You did everything right, son. Every single thing. Her behavior says nothing about you and everything about her. Some people carry hate in their hearts, and they take it out on others who don't deserve it. But this is exactly why we keep fighting, so that other children don't have to face what we faced, what you faced today." He pulled all three children into a hug, and there wasn't a dry eye in that cabin. "You handled this with more grace than most adults could manage. You stood up for each other, you showed respect even when you weren't given any, and you proved that you are stronger than any hatred someone tries to throw at you." But Sarah Mitchell's story wasn't over yet, and what happened next showed exactly the kind of person she really was. As Captain Rodriguez began coordinating with ground control about the incident and the security team that would be waiting at the gate, Sarah's shock transformed into rage. Instead of showing remorse, instead of apologizing for her behavior, she lashed out at everyone around her. "This is ridiculous," she screamed, her voice shrill with desperation. "I was just doing my job. Those kids were being disruptive. And if he hadn't been hiding in first class, pretending to be someone he's not, none of this would have happened. This is discrimination against me." Even in her downfall, Sarah couldn't take responsibility for her actions. She blamed the children. She blamed Marcus for not revealing his identity sooner. She blamed the passengers for recording her behavior. She blamed everyone except the person who was actually responsible, herself. The contrast with Emma Chen couldn't have been more stark. While Sarah raged and deflected, Emma quietly approached Captain Rodriguez and requested to be transferred to a different flight crew when they landed. "I need time to think about what I witnessed today and my role as a bystander," she told him. "I want to be better than I was today." That's the difference between someone who learns from their mistakes and someone who refuses to acknowledge they made any. The rest of the flight passed in a surreal atmosphere of healing and connection. Passengers shared stories, exchanged contact information, and formed bonds over their shared witness to both injustice and justice. The triplets, resilient as children often are, gradually relaxed as they were surrounded by so much kindness and support. When the plane finally touched down in Chicago, Marcus's ex-wife was waiting at the gate. Dr. Patricia Williams, the single mother who had raised these incredible children while working double shifts as a nurse, was initially furious when she learned what had happened during the flight. "You said they'd be safe flying alone," she confronted Marcus, her maternal instincts in full protective mode. "How could you let this happen to them?" But then she saw something that stopped her anger in its tracks. Her children weren't traumatized or broken by their experience. They were standing closer together, more confident in their bond as siblings. Jalen was describing to his mother how he had stood up to the flight attendant. Jordan was excitedly telling her about all the passengers who had offered them support, and Jasmine was already sketching pictures of the kind passengers who had shown them kindness. "Mom," Jalen said with a wisdom that belied his 8 years, "we learned that there are bad people in the world, but there are way more good people, and we learned that we're strong enough to handle the bad ones." Patricia looked at Marcus with new understanding. Sometimes our children have to face the darkness in the world to truly appreciate the light and to become lights themselves. Within hours of landing, David Kim's video had gone viral, but not for the reasons you might expect. Yes, people were outraged by Sarah Mitchell's behavior, but what really captured the world's attention was Marcus's dignified response and the children's incredible resilience. The video sparked conversations about discrimination, about standing up for others, and about the power of responding to hate with grace. Major news outlets picked up the story. Airlines across the industry began implementing new anti-discrimination training programs. Child advocacy groups used the Triplets experience as an example of how to handle adversity with dignity. But the most beautiful part of this story is what happened 6 months later. Emma Chen, who had found her voice that day on Flight 447, was promoted to crew supervisor. Her first initiative? Implementing comprehensive anti-discrimination protocols and bystander intervention training for all flight attendants. She turned her moment of failure into a catalyst for industry-wide change. The Triplets, now 9 years old, were thriving more than ever. The experience hadn't broken them. It had shown them their own strength and the goodness that exists in the world when people choose to stand up for what's right. They were more confident, more resilient, and more determined to make the world a better place. And Marcus? He established the Dignity in Travel Foundation, dedicated to supporting children who face discrimination while traveling and training industry professionals about unconscious bias and inclusive customer service. Sarah Mitchell? She never worked in aviation again. But more importantly, she never learned from her mistakes. Last anyone heard, she was still blaming everyone else for her downfall, a bitter reminder of what happens when we let hate and resentment poison our hearts. This story went viral because it reminded us of something we all need to remember. When we witness injustice, we have a choice. We can stay silent and be complicit, or we can find our courage and stand up for what's right. The Triplets showed us that even children can face hatred with dignity. The passengers showed us that ordinary people can become heroes by simply refusing to stay silent. And Marcus showed us that real leadership means protecting the vulnerable, even when it would be easier to look the away. What would you do if you witnessed discrimination like this happening right in front of you? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below, because these conversations are how we create change. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about speaking up for others, then make sure you hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Because there are more stories like this out there, stories that need to be told, stories that can inspire us all to be better human beings. Sometimes the most ordinary flights become extraordinary reminders that justice, dignity, and love will always triumph over hate, as long as good people refuse to stay silent.